The Tarasoff case is one of the most important and influential cases in psychiatry, law, and ethics. It is a case that forever changed how mental health professionals think about their responsibilities to both their patients and to society. The case involves two students at the University of California at Berkeley, Prasenjit Podar, a young man from Bengal, India, and Tatiana Tarasoff, a bright, outgoing student who enjoyed dancing and making friends from all over the world. This single case helped create what we now know as the duty to warn principle, which is the idea that therapists and counselors have a responsibility to protect potential victims if a patient expresses an intent to harm someone. In 1968, Tanya and Podar met at UC Berkeley during a folk dance class held at the International House where Podar lived. The International House was known for being a place of cultural exchange where people from all around the world came together to share music, food, and friendship. The two began to spend their time together. They saw each other almost weekly, going to movies, dancing, and talking, but their views of the relationship were entirely different. On New Year's Eve, Tanya kissed Podar. To her, it was a friendly gesture, but for Podar, that kiss symbolized something much deeper. He believed it meant they were now in a serious relationship and that they would have a future together. When Tanya later told him that she was not interested in that kind of relationship and that she was interested in seeing other people, it broke him. What might seem like a normal rejection became a deep emotional wound for Podar. After the rejection, his behavior changed dramatically. He became withdrawn, isolated, and depressed. Friends even noticed that he stopped going out and began to neglect his studies. He eventually sought help from a campus psychologist named Dr. Lawrence Moore. This was actually a positive step, and it showed that Podar recognized that he was struggling emotionally and needed support. But what came next turned his therapy session into a legal and ethical turning point in history. During one of his sessions, Podar confided to Dr. Moore that he intended to kill Tanya when she returned home from a trip to Brazil. Dr. Moore took the threat seriously. He consulted with his supervisor and contacted the campus police to inform them that one of the students had made a credible threat of homicide. The police detained Podar briefly for questioning, but after evaluating him, they decided that he appeared rational and calm, so they released him. Podar also promised the police that he would stay away from Tanya. The biggest mistake was that no one ever told Tanya or their family about the threat. Not Dr. Moore, the campus police, or the university. So Tanya went on with her life, unaware that someone was planning to harm her. In October of 1969, a year after the initial sessions, Podar went to Tanya's house. At first, he knocked on the door, asking to see her. Her mother answered and told him that Tanya wasn't home and asked him to leave. He did, but came back later that night carrying a pellet gun and a butcher knife. When Tanya saw him, she began to scream and Podar shot her with the pellet gun. As she ran away, he chased her down and stabbed her repeatedly, killing her. It was a shocking and horrifying event for both the Tarasoff family and the entire university community. What made it even worse was that it could have easily been prevented. There had been clear warnings, professional concern, and police involvement, yet Tanya was never told that she was in danger. Tanya's parents were devastated, but they were also determined that something good should come from their daughter's death. They filed a lawsuit against the psychologist, his supervisor, the campus police, and the University of California. Their claim was very simple but powerful, that the defendants had a duty to warn Tanya or those who could have protected her, and that their failure to do so directly led to her death. The first lawsuit was dismissed because the court said it didn't state a proper cause of action, but the Tarasoffs didn't give up. They appealed, and the case reached the California Supreme Court, where it became known as Tarasoff versus the Regents of California. The Regents of California. In the first major decision, often called Tarasoff 1, the court ruled that therapists have a duty to warn anyone who might be a foreseeable victim of a patient's threat. However, this version of the decision also granted immunity to the campus police and others involved under certain California laws. This ruling stirred major backlash from the psychiatric community. Many therapists argued that forcing them to break confidentiality would destroy the trust between a patient and therapist, a trust that is essential for therapy to work. So the court withdrew the decision to reconsider its implications. 2 years later came the final and more refined decision known as Tarasoff 2. This time, the court ruled 5-2 that mental health professionals have a duty to protect potential victims when a patient poses a serious risk of violence. This wasn't limited to warning the victim. Therapists could also take reasonable steps like notifying law enforcement, arranging hospitalization, or taking other actions to prevent harm. The ruling emphasized 3 main points in its reasoning. Society today is crowded and computerized, meaning that we live in a close connection and depend on one another. Therapists cannot conceal knowledge of lethal danger. Doing so endangers innocent lives. And protecting potential victims outweighs strict confidentiality when a life is at stake. The Tarasoff case opened up deep and complex ethical questions. The first is confidentiality versus protection. Therapists are bound by confidentiality to keep their patients information private. But what happens when keeping that secret could cost someone their life? How do you decide when to break confidentiality? The second issue is predicting violence. Mental health professionals often face uncertainty. Just because someone says something threatening doesn't always mean they'll act on it. So how can a therapist know when a threat is serious enough to warn others? What level of risk is enough to break confidentiality? The Tarasoff rulings didn't give clear-cut answers, but they did set a powerful legal and ethical expectation. When a therapist has reason to believe someone may be in danger, they must act reasonably to prevent further harm. After Tarasoff, laws and policies across the United States began to change. The duty to warn or duty to protect standard became written into many state laws and professional codes of ethics. Today, when you see a therapist, counselor, or psychiatrist, they will often tell you that at the start of your session that they are confidential, except if you make a serious threat to harm yourself or someone else. That exception exists because of the Tarasoff case. This case essentially reshaped the relationship between mental health professionals and their clients, influencing training, record keeping, and risk assessment practices around the world. Not everyone agrees with the rulings made by the court, even today. Critics argue that it weakened therapist-to-patient trust. If patients believe that their private thoughts could be reported, they might hide violent feelings instead of talking about them, which could make things even more dangerous, not less. Others say the rule puts an unfair burden on therapists, forcing them to predict the unpredictable. Mental health professionals aren't mind readers, and even with training, predicting violence is extremely difficult. Yet supporters of the decision argue that even if prediction isn't perfect, inaction can be deadly. The Tarasoff case reminds us that lives are at stake, and doing nothing, as we saw in Tanya's case, can have irreversible consequences. Even decades later, the Tarasoff case remains an essential piece of American mental health law. It's taught in psychology, psychiatry, law, and ethics classes around the world. It forces us to think deeply about a fundamental question. How do we balance individual privacy with public safety? Do we prioritize the rights of one patient or the safety of many? There's no simple answer, but the Tarasoff case ensures that therapists at least ask those questions before it's too late. It's also a reminder of how laws often grow out of tragedy. Tanya Tarasoff's death led to greater awareness, accountability, and legal reform, helping helping prevent similar tragedies from happening to others. Here is the list of sources that I used to gather my research. To this day, the Tarasoff case represents the fine line between ethics, law, and humanity. It reminds us that confidentiality is not absolute, and that doing nothing can sometimes be more dangerous than speaking up. Overall, it's a story of loss that became a lesson, one that continues to guide how we think about responsibility, morality, and protection in the field of mental health. Thank you.